Hopefully it is recording correctly. All right. So we are going to discuss today the end of the liberal 60s. All right. So we kind of ended with the culmination of 1968 and the Democratic National Convention. And so now we're going to move forward with the presidency initially under Richard Nixon, Nixon is going to push forward a initiative or a program that he calls Bring Us Together. And as you guys may recall, especially with the violence that ensued after or during the 1968 Democratic National Convention, remember we discussed how the Republican National Convention was like all happy days and everybody's like so excited and happy about life. And then people are literally like fighting on the convention floor. And then there's great protests outside the convention and like on the streets of Chicago. So people in like middle America, so average Americans, are horrified at what they see after these conventions. So Nixon puts this platform together called Bring Us Together because he believed that Americans were looking for a place of healing. And as a result, Nixon projects a lot of confidence. He runs his campaign, his ultimate national campaign under the guise of law and order and what he calls peace with honor. And what he's talking about there, peace with honor means ending the war in Vietnam, but honorably. All right, so here you can see Richard Nixon being sworn into office in 1969. One of the key provisions of Nixon's platform is what he calls the war on crime. He calls it the war on crime. We see that rural and suburban Americans believed that the civil rights movement had gone too far, that they had liberalized the urban landscape too much. And so Nixon is going to come in and double down and increase the budgets for local police forces. And this is something that is embraced by rural and suburban America. So people living outside of the urban areas. So Nixon is our war on crime president. And really, if you look at modern politics, a lot of the rhetoric that we get from the modern Republican Party comes from Richard Nixon. So often you will hear, especially in a presidential election year, you'll hear Republican candidates talking a lot about like law and order, like that's kind of like their clip point there, and especially you'll see if a Republican has been in office, they'll talk about how crime rates have decreased under the Republican president. But if a Democrat's been in office, they'll highlight, oh, look, in Chicago, all of these crimes are going up. And they'll specifically look at liberal, quote unquote, liberal cities to like vilify. And the Democratic Party is going to look at quote unquote Republican cities to try to vilify. So both sides use it, but the Republicans really rest a lot even today on law and order, which comes from the Nixon presidency. Nixon also implements what he calls the Southern strategy. He implements what he calls the Southern strategy. You might recall that with the Civil Rights Act, Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, had put a lot of weight on getting the Civil Rights Act passed, which secures things like voting, access to the ballot in the South for African Americans, things like that. When Lyndon Johnson gets the Civil Rights Act passed, he says famously, "I've lost the South." Because remember that the South is a core Democratic voting bloc, and most Southerners are against the civil rights movement. Richard Nixon deftly understands this. So when he becomes president, he starts what he calls the Southern strategy, and it's his move to get the Republican Party to cater to Southerners so that they will join the Republican Party. All right. So Nixon and his Attorney General, John Mitchell, this is their plan to get the Republicans reelected and to win the Senate in the federal Senate and the federal House in 1970, which is the off-year election, and in 1972. Nixon will come out strong and oppose extension of the Voting Rights Act, which is very popular in the South. The Southerners do not want the Voting Rights Act extended. Mitchell is going to support Mississippi school districts opposing integration. So a lot of Mississippi schools don't want to integrate, and Mitchell comes in as the Attorney General of the United States and says that you don't have to integrate. Both of these folks opposed the busing strategy, which was a strategy being used to achieve desegregation. So the idea is we will bus students across town so that we can integrate all public schools, especially in urban areas. So let's talk a little bit about the busing issue specifically. Busing is a big issue in the American South. Probably not surprising to you. Most white folks do not want busing to occur. They do not want Black students being bused into their white school districts. Nixon, remember, he's having his Southern strategy. He will come out regularly and call the busing issue the new quote unquote evil. It's the new evil. And as a result of this, young white voters are starting to turn away from the Democratic Party and more towards the Republican Party. According to Nixon, the busing issue will place hardships on children and disrupts local communities. The Supreme Court will prevent Richard Nixon from ending the busing practices. Richard Nixon tries to make it stop, and the Supreme Court will step in and say, no, you can't do that. Now, for the most part, the Supreme Court is pretty liberal up until about 1973, which is why you get the Roe versus Wade decision, which I don't know if you guys know this. I mean, I'm sure you all know Roe versus Wade. I'd say that to you, and that means something to you guys. But I don't know if you know this, that the Roe versus Wade case was filed in Dallas, Texas. I don't, you know, did any of you guys know that? No? Yeah. So also fun fact, because I study gay civil rights in Dallas, the district attorney, his name is Wade. That's his name. So Roe versus Wade. The case that's real big in my research is called Baker versus Wade. It's the same guy. Yeah, so just a fun fact there. It's based out of Dallas, is where Roe v. Wade comes from. As you can see, here's a picture of some white students protesting the busing issue in the early 70s in East Dallas. And you can see here that they want to remain and have segregation keep going on. Save East Dallas. Don't let it be desegregated. This is John Ehrlichman. He was appointed counsel and assistant to the president on domestic affairs. He is going to resist pushing for integration or resist requiring integration in public schools. But eventually, he will start to enforce the law. And during the 1970-1971 school year, most schools in the country will integrate, including Tyler ISD and the integration of the formerly known Robert E. Lee High School. Okay, so John Ehrlichman, he's counsel and assistant to the president on domestic affairs. When Chief Justice Earl Warren retires, I don't know if you guys know this, surely you do if you paid any attention to the last 5 years in this country, but presidents get to nominate Supreme Court nominees. So Warren Burger is going to be Nixon's nomination to replace the Chief Justice Earl Warren. He is a very popular, moderate, conservative judge, and he will win nomination pretty easily. He will be nominated and he will be put on the court, but he is a conservative judge. Okay. Nixon will also want to replace Abe Fortas with Clement Haynesworth. He is from South Carolina. He vehemently opposes integration, which means he doesn't want Black and white students going to the same school. The Senate will ultimately reject his nomination. And in fact, it's not just Republicans, it's not just Democrats who are rejecting Haynesworth. It's also 17 Republicans will vote against this pick, which is usually, it's very uncommon for a president to nominate somebody and to have dissent that big among the president's party on the nominee, right? I assume it goes without saying, but I'm going to put it out there for you guys. The president is the leader of that political party. Like he's kind of like the person, or she, if there's ever a female president, that's the leader of the political party. So for a president like Richard Nixon of the Republican Party to nominate somebody and to have 17 people within his party kind of buck the system and like outwardly reject the nomination is a pretty big deal. I'm not saying these people wouldn't reject it behind the scenes. They may like send word to the White House like, hey, I'm not going to vote for this person. And then generally they figure that out as they're like narrowing down the list of people that are going to be nominated. They usually know that there's people are going to vote for their candidate when they nominate them. Either way, this is G. Harold Carswell. He's Nixon's next nominee. And remember, Nixon has the Southern strategy in his brain. And we know this because he talks about it a lot and he wrote about it a lot. So I'm not just like, you know, putting this thing on him. We know he's thinking about the Southern strategy. And so Nixon will nominate Carswell, who publicly declared his, quote, firm, vigorous belief in white supremacy. And in fact, of his decisions that go up to the court, go like to the higher court, 60% of his rulings have been overturned. That's not good. That's not a good look. All right. Probably not all that surprising to you. The Senate will also reject Carswell to the Supreme Court. He will not be nominated. So Nixon's going to come out. He's a very interesting fella, to say the least, Richard Nixon. And he's very angry. So he will come out and blame the Senate for his vicious assaults, what he calls a vicious assaults on his nominees, because he's nominating people from the South, and the Senate just doesn't like Southerners. Remember, that's all a part of that Southern strategy, right? So you have Southerners who are already dissatisfied with the Democratic Party for pushing in things like integration and civil rights acts. They're looking for another alternative. And then you got this Republican candidate or Republican president standing up for what they would see as Southern values, and they're going to start latching on to the Republican Party. Okay. So this is Nixon's anger at his rejection of Supreme Court nominees only gains him support in the South. The next nominee is Harry Blackmun. He is from Minnesota, and he's a moderate judge, and he's easily confirmed. Generally speaking, it is a little bit of an anomaly, the last three people who were put on the Supreme Court. But generally speaking, people who get put on the Supreme Court are usually pretty moderate. And the reason for that is neither side wants to allow extremists on the court, because that could essentially affect politics or the state of the country for the next 30 or 40 years. So they try to maintain some moderatism there. Yeah.
I thought they got elected and they stood that seat until they died.
They do, but some people retire. So like, for example,
So that's why this is a huge deal.
yeah. And so some people retire. And so just to kind of like hop into modern politics, because we understand it more, under President Obama, before 2014, because the presidential election off year is 2014, and then the presidential election is 2016, people really wanted Ruth Bader Ginsburg to retire like in 2013, because the Democrats had control of the Congress, and then they could nominate somebody who's probably a little bit more like RBG, but she didn't. And then she died, and then Trump got to put somebody in. Yeah.
That's basically my question was going to that. It seems like he nominated all people. Is there that many yet?
Some people are dying because they're old. Yeah. And Supreme Court's a position where most people get on and they're just like, no, I'm holding on for life. The oldest member of the Supreme Court right now is a more liberal guy. And his name is like, I can't remember his name now. But for like all of the summer, this past summer, because the Democrats control both houses of Congress and the Democrats control the White House, there were like people hiring, those trucks that drive around and they're just billboards, like they're like kind of like skinny and they're billboards, driving around Washington, D.C., like calling for him to retire, so that specifically so Joe Biden can put somebody younger, right? It's relative, like they're all like at least 60, right? But put somebody younger than like this 80-year-old guy on the court. So this is pretty common. Yes.
Wasn't there like a controversy because he didn't want to like replace somebody before the presidential election?
So yes. So first of all, it's all politics, right? And it is what it is. So when Barack Obama was president and the Republicans controlled Congress, Barack Obama nominated the replacement for, it wasn't Kennedy. He was super conservative. Now I can't even think of his name, but he nominated a person, our current attorney general, and Mitch McConnell, who was the leader of the Senate, refused to bring the nomination up. Merrick Garland refused to bring the nomination up. And at the time, Mitch McConnell's argument was that it was during a presidential election year. So it was in 2016, and it was in the spring. And he said, we should let the people decide, and the next president gets to nominate the person. Then RBG dies in the late summer of 2020, which is a presidential year. And so all of the Democrats start, balking at the idea that Donald Trump would nominate somebody who Amy Coney Barrett is the nominee, to replace RBG literally like within weeks of the election, because their argument was, well, you said, let the people decide, and let the next, whoever's elected next president replace that seat. And essentially Mitch McConnell did what Mitch McConnell does and says, no, I'm gonna do it anyway. And that's how they got Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. So there's not a lot of rules to it. The only rule is the president gets to nominate somebody. Also, we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. 9, I think is right. There's no number. Like technically, like this would be political suicide, but technically Joe Biden could say, okay, I'm going to nominate 5 more people and put them on the Supreme Court. And he could do that. Like he doesn't need Congress to say, oh, there's 9 more people. He could unilaterally say that, and he just has to put nominees forth, and the Congress has to like either say yes or no, they're on the court. But I think that would be political suicide, because people would be like, well, you're just court packing. And we saw how terrible that worked for FDR. So it's political suicide to do that. But yeah, so if that makes sense. But there's not rules. There's no rules. There's like kind of like, well, this is kind of how it's been done in the past, so we kind of follow this, but we can change the rules at any time. And both sides randomly will change rules, to be fair. So I'm not like I am picking on Mitch McConnell. I don't like him, because I like people who at least say what they say and do what they say, right? Like if it's this way, it should be this way always. That's just my personal opinion. It doesn't have anything to really do with him and his political party. It's just his personality. I don't like him. My personal opinion. But there are also plenty of Democrats I don't like. Yeah. Yeah. I know a lot of Republicans who are like hardcore Republicans who do not like Mitch McConnell, because he seems slimy to me, which is why I don't like him. Anyway, get off my soapbox. So Harry Blackmun will be nominated and will be appointed to the Supreme Court. So we see what's called, what Nixon calls new federalism. And this is kind of the response to the Great Society. If you recall, the Great Society was LBJ's approach to domestic issues in the United States. So Nixon wants to reduce federal programs, right? So they want to get rid of a lot of federal spending and return control and revenue back to the states, right? He's going to return control and revenue back to the states. So this is under this new federalism also is where you start to see what is largely evolved in today to the Republican Party focusing on what we would call like decentralization, right? The federal government being smaller and letting states have more control of what's going on in their individual state. I would argue the only problem with that is that you can have people being mistreated or overlooked in one state and then those freedoms being recognized in another state. If you don't have a federal government, you don't have like a uniform like system of values. All right. Under Nixon, we see what's known as the Family Assistance Plan. The Family Assistance Plan. He being Richard Nixon, consults David Patrick Moynihan, who is an academic who studies, like a sociologist who studies these types of programs in action. And they decide to streamline poverty and welfare programs. So you would think probably at this point, what I'm telling you, that Nixon is trying to eliminate a lot of these programs. In reality, he's trying to make them more efficient, to where instead of having 3 offices do one thing, we'll have one office who does all 3 things. All right. And what he's doing here is cutting what they call the federal bureaucracy. So again, streamlining things. Why do we need 3 different office buildings full of people doing similar things? We can eliminate 2 of those buildings, which means that reduces federal spending, because we don't have to, pay all those people. We don't have to run the utilities in those 2 buildings. We don't have to rent those or own those 2 buildings type thing, right? So we're going to reduce that spending, and that's how they're reducing the funding, not by reducing what's going to the people. Okay. Through the Family Assistance Plan, it would guarantee a stipend of at least $1,600 and what they called at the time food stamps, because there used to actually be like stamps. Now you have like the ETB card that you have for people who are on meal assistance. But these things would go directly to families. So instead of like relying on, because in the past you would have to go to like an office and pick up your food stamps and all of these other things. Well, this would just come directly to you in the US mail. So this is the Family Assistance Plan, trying to make things more streamlined, trying to save government money by eliminating unnecessary bureaucracy. And for Richard Nixon, this is actually a pretty liberal program. For Republicans writ large, this is pretty liberal. So as a result, the conservative portion of the Republican Party is going to come out and annihilate him on it. And the far right conservative part of the Republican Party at the time is led by a guy, maybe you've heard of him, Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan called it the Family Annihilation Plan. As a result of this, one, the Democrats weren't super pleased with the number. They thought the program, $1,600 was too low. They wanted more. But Ronald Reagan and the conservatives, the more conservative portion of the Republican Party, is horrified completely. And they actually call this reward for being idle, which the idea that's commonly associated with welfare programs is that people are lazy, that they don't want to work, and that they're not, like contributing to society. They're just, like sitting around, I guess, like smoking weed and like making babies. That's usually what you hear about people who live off federal assistance programs. In reality, from academic research, we know that that's actually not true, that most people who live on or have access to family assistance programs work jobs, usually multiple jobs. Unfortunately, they're usually part-time, not part-time, but minimum wage jobs. And as a result of that, they still can't make ends meet. So yeah, just to kind of throw that out there for you. Ultimately, the family assistance plan is going to die in the Senate, and then they're going to maintain the programs that were initially established under LBJ. So Nixon does have some liberal policies, and remember, this will be posted online for you guys. Under Richard Nixon, we get OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So this idea that there are workplace standards, right? Like if any of you guys have ever worked a job, surely you had to be told about OSHA at some point. Right. So workplace standards here, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, right, which just to make fun of him because I think it's funny, what Rick Perry, who's the former governor of Texas, when he was running for president in 2016, when there was a huge number of Republicans running, Rick Perry, who was over the EPA, was asked, what program would you get rid of in the federal government? And he said the EPA, which is hilarious because that was his, like, most people aren't going to be like, I'll get rid of my job. That's why it's funny, because it'd be like me being like, oh, we should get rid of history programs. Never will I say that, right? It's funny. The EPA becomes the nation's largest regulatory commission. We also see the DEA created. The DEA is super important because it regulates what kind of drugs can be used in medical situations, and it monitors like medical providers, like when they, how much like opioids are they prescribing, or how much of this is like they're being prescribed. Also, fun fact, chase this rabbit here today. So my girlfriend is a PA, so she has a DEA number so that she can like write prescriptions. And we were talking about this one day, and so there's like different levels. So there's like category like 1, 2, and 3. And so as a PA, she can only write category 2 and 3. And I was like, well, what's a category 1 drug? And she's like, like LSD. I was like, what? And she said, yeah, some, like as a PA, she could never write a category 1. But some medical doctors who also do like research and like research LSD can write prescriptions for like minute amounts of LSD. I didn't even know that was a thing. 100% a thing, right? They're called Schedule 1, 2, and 3. That's what they're called. She said Schedule 1 drugs, which are like LSD, even things like ecstasy, like hard drugs, cocaine can be in that category as well. Is it a 2?
Marijuana is a 1.
Yeah, marijuana is a 1. I did know that. That those drugs are very rarely written, and usually it's under a very like controlled circumstance, and it's like at some kind of like research facility type thing. It's not like, you're at Walmart and you're in the hospital and you go pick it up at Walmart. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense, does it? That all comes from the 70s is where that comes into. Yeah. 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 Which makes sense. So as a result, I would assume just by knowing that, in order to be a medical doctor who prescribes medical marijuana, I would assume PAs like Katie, because she can't prescribe Schedule 1 drugs, probably cannot, like, well, in Texas, I don't even know if they have what they call medical marijuana, but like if we were in Colorado or something, she probably wouldn't be able to write it. Interesting. So that's what the DEA does. That's why it's important. He doesn't cut actually Great Society programs. He continued the Model Cities program, which is where they put funding into urban areas to try to build up like dilapidated apartment buildings and things like that, restore like green spaces in cities, those kinds of stuff. He also increased funding for food stamps, Medicare and Medicaid, and supported the 26th Amendment, which changed the voting age to 18. So before that, the voting age was actually 21. And this becomes a big issue during the Vietnam War, because the argument is, how are you going to send people who aren't allowed to vote, whether you should make decisions on the Vietnam War to fight in a war? If they can't vote, they shouldn't have to go, basically is the argument. I would also argue, and this is my personal opinion, that if you're old enough to go fight for our country, you should also be old enough to buy a beer. That's my personal opinion. You guys can have your own opinions, but that's my opinion. Nixon's foreign policies, he opened up negotiations, I should say negotiation, or he was open to negotiations with the Soviets and China, which he did. He established a policy of detente between the Soviets and China, so kind of like ratcheting down that increased tension. In reality, a lot of historians think that Richard Nixon was the perfect guy to do this, because if you guys recall, way back in the 1950s, he was the vice president under Eisenhower, but before he was the vice president under Eisenhower, he was part of rooting out communists in the federal government. Like, he was a big guy in the Senate helping on Joseph McCarthy with that kind of, finding the communists in the 1950s. So nobody's going to suspect or think Richard Nixon is soft on communism because of his previous past of his like hard prosecution of communists in this country. So as him coming in and easing these relationships with the Soviets and China, it actually made it possible. Whereas if it had been like LBJ or John F. Kennedy, it would have been like, oh, these liberals are in here and they are just soft on communism, and it would have never happened. The United States also engaged the Soviets about limiting their strategic arms in the strategic arm race. So all of these things happened under Nixon. We also get what's called the Nixon Doctrine. Under this doctrine, the United States is going to begin allowing allies to assume more responsibilities for their own defense. So the federal government, the US government, isn't going to go out and spend all of its money defending all of NATO or all of the countries all over the world. And also through Nixon, we see that the United States would limit their involvement in revolutionary wars. We were highly involved in revolutionary wars in the 1960s, propping up generally dictators who are willing to say, oh, I don't believe in communism, but I'm a really bad guy and I'm a dictator, and I'm going to run these small Latin American countries as my little fiefdoms, as long as they're saying we're not communists. The US government's pretty much okay with that. And Nixon's going to actually start to limit that. So this leads us back to the social aspect here. So we kind of understand how Nixon is. In the early 1970s at San Francisco State University, the university only had 700 Black students enrolled, which was only 4% of their student population. And there's a small student union, the Black Student Union, and many people had become very politically active in the student organization, and they embraced what they called third world revolution. So a lot of like communist or Marxist adjacent ideas. And so they start making demands on the university that they want what's known as a Black Studies department. They want to see the hiring of more African-American professors, and they want these African-American professors teaching about the African-American experience. They don't want like some old white guy standing up telling about what it's like to be African-American in the United States, right? So they are wanting this change in their university. So they start protesting at San Francisco State University. Probably not that surprising to you. It doesn't go over well, which is funny because mostly when we think about universities in California in the 60s and 70s, we think about like these great liberal bastions of people being, so active and everybody just embracing it. That is not how it was. San Francisco State University is going to bring San Francisco police on campus, which is going to lead to more protesters. The police are ultimately going to attack protesters. And one of the leaders of the protest movement said, you can tell every racist pig in the world, including Richard Milhouse Nixon, so citing the president specifically here, that we're not going to negotiate until the demands are met, right? So this is kind of gives you an idea of the state of life on campus at San Francisco State University. Ultimately, over 600 police officers occupied campus for 134 days, which is the length of the strike. And over 700 activists will be arrested. And I'll note that there are 700 Black students on campus. Just going to point that out. During the spring of 1969, the university ultimately agrees to create a Black Studies department They also waived admission requirements for African-American students and admitted numerous third world students. So today we do not use the word third world. Today we would use the term lesser developed. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Poorer countries are admitting students from those countries into campus, and they offered many students financial aid to come to campus. And the idea here from the Black Student Union is, one, Black voices aren't being recognized or heard on campus, academically speaking. And then two, you are limiting the access to knowledge and access to, a future, right? So a lot of folks see it that if you have access to college, which means you can get a college degree, then you're more likely to get a better paying job and to have more generational wealth. You may not be like super rich, but then if you went to college and you have a good paying job, then you can have kids, and your kids can hopefully go to good schools, and they can go to college and get a good paying job, or they can go to a technical school and become like a carpenter or a master carpenter or a plumber or something like that. Then they can get a good, see where we're going with this, right? But if you've never had access to those things and you continue to bar access to those things, then you just continually have poor people only promoting more poor situations down the road, if that makes sense. So one of our academic activists that we're going to see come out of this movement, some of you may have heard of her. She's still alive today. She's still a professor today. Her name is Angela Davis. Angela Davis. She studied with a Marxist philosopher. So in order to understand this, Marxism is part of communism, but it's not necessarily Sovietism, okay? It's like early communism. But she studied with a Marxist philosopher. His name is Herbert Marcuse at UC San Diego. So that's University of California, San Diego, in the late 1960s. And while she was a graduate student, she organized a coalition of Black and brown students and led protests all around California. So this is Angela Davis. She also becomes associated pretty closely with the Black Panther Party, which serves to be a little problematic for her later in life. The Black Panthers will be organized by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. They have been influenced by Malcolm X. Oh, speaking of which, did you guys see that the two guys who were accused of killing Malcolm X like 2 or 3 weeks ago, they got out of jail in the 1980s. One of them has passed away, but the other one, both men though, were exonerated for the killing of Malcolm X. Like they did not kill Malcolm X. There's pretty sufficient evidence to prove that. And it's been like 30, 40 years that people have been fighting to get them exonerated. So they're influenced by Malcolm X and the shooting of a Black man who was stopped by police named Matthew Johnson, who was gunned down by police officers in California. By 1968, there are about 2,000 members of the Black Panther Party. They would frequently monitor police activities in Black communities around Oakland. So they start in the San Francisco, Oakland area. And what we're talking about here is police activities. They are out on the streets, making sure that their community is safe, especially once the police come into the neighborhoods, because generally speaking, also at this point, you should probably know that police forces are generally all white, usually, and I can't say for certain in California at this point, but usually Black folks are not allowed to join like the fire department, the police department, things like that. So they are trying to look out for the Black communities because white officers usually have very little regard for Black communities. You do not have to write this down. Just listen, I want you to kind of like see, this is what the Black Panther Party stands for. First of all, freedom. And there are some communist adjacent ideas in here, okay? I'm not saying that these guys had, these ideas that were purely, capitalistic in nature, all right? But they believe in freedom, full employment, which means that people should be able to work a full-time job that would enable them to support their families, right? They should not have to work a full-time job and then still not be able to provide. They want to end the robbery of the Black community. They want decent housing fit for the shelter of human beings because they recognize that a lot of Black communities are very poor and do not have great housing standards. They want education for the people, free health care. They want to end police brutality and murder of Black people and other people of color and all oppressed people. They want to end all wars of aggression, which in this case would also include the Vietnam War. They want freedom for all political prisoners. That ain't ever going to happen, not in the United States. And then they want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and community control of the modern industry. So that's the communist part. That's the big communist part right there. But the other things really aren't that, outrageous to think of. Like I said, they're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I think I've referenced this to you guys before, though. The Black Panther Party didn't just say things, they actually put their money where their mouth was. And this is an example of that. They had free breakfast programs for school children. So a lot of kids, if their parents couldn't afford to feed them before they'd go to school, there was a community center that's manned by members of the Black Panther Party where the kids could come and eat. And they could also stay there until like the school bus arrived, which means they're not just like standing out on the street corner. So they're safe. They're in a safe location. They also opened free healthcare clinics in 13 African-American communities across the United States, where anybody that was in that community could go and get free healthcare, no charge, access to medicine, things like that. Also, I don't know if I have a picture of it. I don't. But they also had after-school programs. And often what you would see in a lot of these different political movements. So, for example, with the Chicano movement, they would relegate women to doing like all of like the female jobs, quote unquote female jobs, like feeding kids. Well, the Black Panther Party is a little bit different. Yes, you do see women here, but there's also a guy there. And in the afternoons, a lot of times it's men who are running the after school program, and they're the ones who are helping kids with their homework and making sure they have snacks. So it's not like these Black Panther leaders are just saying, okay, ladies, go do this ladies' work while we go over here and do men stuff. They're participating and being a part of the community as a whole. So it's not just, we're on our little perch up here watching what's going on. So here's an example of, so this is from one of the community centers for the Black Panther Party. And then you can see this is 2 women. They have received free food from the free food program. And so the People's Free Food Program is what they call it. The Black Panther Party is sometimes referred to as the People's Black Panther Party or the People's Party. So that's why it says People's on it. But yeah, so what they would do, especially for citizens, like elderly citizens who probably couldn't get around as well, a member of the Black Panther Party would go and get like a list, like what groceries do you need? And then they would go to the food pantry and then bring them back and give it to the people in their community. But the FBI starts monitoring the Black Panther Party. So there's a counterintelligence program. You don't have to know the lingo there. Just so the first subpoint, don't worry about it. But they consistently monitored the Black Panther Party. In 1969, J. Edgar Hoover, which is the head of the FBI at the time, declared the Black Panther Party a communist organization. And again, with their 10-point plan, that 10th one, it's really putting them in that categorization. But also the FBI will use intel to exploit tensions between various Black nationalist groups. Because by this point, Martin Luther King is dead and the Black civil rights movement is kind of splintered. And so the FBI is going to work groups against each other to raise more hostilities, which ultimately hinder the movement of the activism writ large. Also, there are 2 Black Panthers in Chicago who will be gunned down by Chicago police, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, who were active in the Black Panther Party in Chicago. They will be assassinated by the Chicago Police Department, and there are no consequences for that. In 1969, so just talking about Angela Davis. So she is very active with the Black Panther Party and in politics writ large. So Angela Davis will be fired as a professor. She was teaching at UCLA. Students and faculty are going to protest to have her reinstated. Also, in the early 1970s, Davis will fight to improve conditions of state and federal prisons, trying to increase that as a result. Eventually, Angela Davis will be connected to a prisoner. His name is Jonathan P. Jackson, who was being tried in a court case, and she was being an activist trying to get him released. And they found the government found a gun that was registered to Angela Johnson. Excuse me, not Angela Johnson. She's a funny comedian. Registered to Angela Davis that was used in a crime. So now Angela Davis has been implemented in a crime with this gun, and she is now wanting for questioning. And so she flees. She actually leaves California and goes to New York and hides out for a while. And she becomes one of the 10 most wanted people in the country by the FBI. Ultimately, the FBI will find her and arrest her in Manhattan. And then in the end, There's a movement called Free Angela Davis. 2 years after her arrest, the court system will acquit her of all charges, which means that they were not really there, right? So she will continue her career as a political activist and a professor. Like I said, she is still teaching today. So if you guys are interested, you could probably, because she didn't trust the police. And she probably had good cause for that, considering a lot of her friends were being assassinated by the police at the time. So that's why she fled. We also see the creation of a new organization called the National Organization for Women, also referred to as NOW. All right. They advocated for equal opportunities for women. They oppose the idea or the tradition that men should shoulder the burden of supporting their family. So fun fact, during this time period, if you were a woman and you were single, you might make a certain wage. But once you got married and your husband starts, like, you know, the company sees that you're married, they're going to stop giving you pay raises because your husband's supposed to support you. That's the idea, right? So they reject that idea. And they wrote what's known as a Bill of Rights for Women. All right, so this is a group of women from NOW protesting here. So some of the platform or some of the things you might see on a platform for NOW, they want equal access to education and jobs. They want enforcement of laws that ban sex discrimination. They want to receive maternity leave for working mothers. So fun fact, maternity leave wasn't always just a thing that you got. All right. They wanted federally funded daycare centers. They wanted women's rights to control her own reproductive life, like things like abortion, adoption, access to things like birth control. Up into the 1970s in Connecticut, for example, the only people who could get birth control pills were married couples. The case is Griswold versus Connecticut. Connecticut versus Griswold. I think it's Griswold versus Connecticut is the Supreme Court case that struck that down and said that women could get access to birth control pills. But for the longest time, it was just married women. And they also support what's known as the Equal Rights Amendment. And essentially what the Equal Rights Amendment is, it says that all women will be treated equal to men in this country, right? So that's the Equal Rights Amendment. We see a more conservative version of NOW called the Women's Equity Action League. They avoided issues like abortion and sexuality. So those are two things that they don't want to talk about because those are kind of like what we would call a third rail issue. So for those of you who know anything about like subways, like the third rail, that's the electric rail. And so if it's a third rail issue, that means that it's going to be polarizing. It's going to make some people really happy, but make a lot of people really mad. So you just kind of avoid it. They demanded, though, equal opportunities in education, economics, and employment. So you can see these women here. So they're more conservative in the fact that they're not pushing as hard for like reproductive rights and things like that. We do see a lot of double standards. We do see a lot of double standards in the country. Male activists will take the center stage, which I kind of referenced to that with the Chicano movement. They're not the only organization that does this. Women were expected to answer phones and make meals for folks. In a hippie movement, females were expected to have several sexual partners, like within hippie communes. Women didn't have a lot of, they did not have like a lot of control of their own body, right? And this scene leaves a lot of women feeling very exploited within those communes. Bill Wyman of the Rolling Stones, he's a famous musician, coined the term groupie, which meant women who followed the band around, and band members were often expected, or groupies were often expected to have sex with band members after the shows. So if you were a groupie that followed around, it was like you were the personal like choice. Like they just pick one, and if you got picked, you were expected to have sex with the band member. We see sexism in America, which still exists today. Men told women driver jokes, which the idea is that women can't drive. Fun fact, women are actually much safer drivers than men. And generally speaking, women, as a result, so you guys are young, so y'all might realize this. If I'm not mistaken, female insurance rates, like car insurance rates, go down at 23 or 24. Like your insurance, your rates stop being so high, but men's rates don't go down until they're like 25, right? Because men are more likely to get in accidents and things like that, just statistically speaking. You see popular magazines belittling women. Fun fact, the Boston Marathon refused female entrants, even in the 1970s. They said it was, quote, unhealthy for women to run long distances. Women are often excluded from bars and clubs unless they have a male escort. So this is even in the 1970s, not that long ago. Women could not just freely go into a bar. So this, I cannot remember her name, but she illegally ran the Boston Marathon, right? So there she is, she ran it to prove that women could actually run long distances. And this is another lady who was she registered and she had like kind of a gender neutral name. So she just registered. And then when the guys on the race figured it out that she's running the marathon, they're literally pushing her off the trail, like or out of the race. And the guy over here in 225, that's like one of her friends. And he's like, hey, what's happening? But literally they pushed her out. Like she was not allowed to finish the race. Advertisements that are pretty belittling to men. So this is the Mini. So if you guys like Mini Coopers and stuff, that's the car company over here. They have an automatic car for simple drivers, which are obviously women, right? It's nice to have a girl around the house. There you go. She knows where she belongs, which kind of like means on the floor, and obviously sexually provocative here because she's not wearing clothes. Here trying to decide what kind of pudding she's going to make for her husband before he gets home. So the idea is he gets congratulated for being promoted to assistant vice president, but she sat around all day trying to figure out how to make the right pudding. Yeah. There's also popular myths about gender that are being pushed during this time period, like by nature's design, women are weak, emotional, and passive. And as a result of this, and you even still see this today in some places, if you hear that a woman, you'll often hear that a woman is bossy or being a bitch. Those are words for like women who are in charge of something. But if it's a guy doing the exact same thing, the analogy is, oh, he has great leadership, or he is a strong leader, things like that. And I'm not just like talking off the top of my head. There's actual studies that people have like witnessed and like had these events happening. Women were also told they could avoid, quote, penis envy if they realized that they're just different and refrain from doing things beyond their, quote, female disposition. So some of these things could be like being an airline pilot or being a doctor or being, a scientist, things like that. Because you're female, you're not fit to do those jobs. These are some of the acceptable terminologies for women. And when I say negative here, I'm saying this is negative words that were often used. I'm not saying that they were not allowed to use these words. So if they were going to positively talk about women, they would call them girls, dolls, foxes, chicks. Negative words, bitches, whores, sluts, tramps, broads, and pussies. Yeah. See, I told you guys we were going to talk about awful stuff in this class, and y'all were like, nah, last day, we're talking about it. Job categories, or next to the last day. Job categories in the late 1960s would include for men, business executive, CEO, scientists, which include medical doctors, researcher, engineers. Females were often pushed aside to do things like nursing, teaching, and home economics, which this is still some stuff that still exists today, right? So if you ask a child, I don't know if you have any children in your life, like young kids, so not somebody who's like a moody teenager, a child. What does a doctor look like? Almost always they'll describe a dude. And if you ask them, what does a nurse look like? Almost always they'll describe a woman, right? Or if you show them pictures of like a doctor and like a man and a woman wearing lab coats, which one's the doctor and which one's the nurse? Like there's scientific studies, like psychological studies that are done that kids still kind of pick this way. Also during this time period, there was studies on race where they took dolls of different colors. Like so they had like baby dolls from like white to very dark black. And they would ask kids, white kids, brown kids, black kids, which one's the good doll? And they'd almost always choose a lighter skinned doll. Which one's the bad doll? They'd almost choose the darkest color, right? So it's all of these like, I guess maybe subconscious things that are being taught to kids. I don't know, because I'm not a psychologist, but I do know that these studies exist. So this tells us kind of like what life was like during this time period. So just talking about jobs by the numbers, schools would maintain quotas to minimize women in professional and graduate schools. And we're talking about like colleges, right? So we don't want too many women signing up for programs that are like pre-med. So we may have like 3 positions and then the rest go to the dudes. During this time period, only 2% of dentists are women. Only 3% of women are lawyers are women, and 7% of physicians are women. There are very few female professors, journalists, or business executives because they were often not allowed to get into those career fields, like just being barred just because they're female. Generally speaking, women with college degrees had 3 opportunities: teach, type, or take temperatures. That was what they would refer to it at the time. right? So teaching, right? And not at a university like this, but like in a elementary, middle, or public school. Typing, meaning you're going to be a secretary, or take temperatures, so you're going to be a nurse. In higher education, universities advertise for male professors only, like in their job postings. Airline stewardess were fired if they got married or when they turned 32. So we're not desirable anymore. 80% of teachers are women, and about 10% of principals and 3% of superintendents were women. And so there's also a reverse to this as well, right? Like even today, you shouldn't look at somebody and say, what does a nurse look like, and describe a woman, right? If you're a guy and a nurse, which I have some friends who are guys and nurses, they're great nurses, right? We shouldn't be like, oh, that's a girl's job. It's not a girl's job. It is a job, right? But you see a lot of this stigmatization going on in the 60s and 70s. Speaking of RBG from earlier, Ruth Bader Ginsburg will graduate first in her class at Columbia Law. She actually started off as one of the few females admitted into Harvard Law. Her husband was a year ahead of her, and when he graduated and moved to New York, she moved with him and transferred to Columbia. Columbia Law is a very prestigious program. Unfortunately, even though she was first in her class, she could not get a job offer to be a lawyer in the city of New York, nor could she get a judicial clerkship, right? So that's usually getting a clerkship is your pathway to becoming a Supreme Court justice or becoming a judge. In fact, Justice Felix Frankfurter, yes, that is his name. Judge Felix Frankfurter was a U.S. judge, and somebody that knew RBG asked him to interview her to be a clerk. And he asked specifically if she wore skirts when he was asked to consider her. And he said that he refused her because he couldn't stand girls in pants. This is the reason that he did not want her to work with him. So there are double standards in the law. 18 states prevented women from serving on any jury. In Arizona, women could be fined for using obscene language. In New York, female juveniles could be jailed for promiscuous behavior. So that means that if you're a juvenile under the age of 18 and you're engaging in sex with a boy, or with a girl, but if you're engaging sex with a boy and you're female, you could go to like juvie, but the boy would not go to juvie, doing the exact same thing with you at the exact same time. Schools expelled pregnant girls, which is why you often see that girls will suddenly go live with their Aunt Martha for 8 months or something like that. Or also, this is why you see people getting illegal abortions in alleyways and in hotels, because abortion at this point is not legal. Rape laws will require victims to physically resist. So like if you're being tied up and raped, if you don't physically resist enough, then you weren't really raped. If the victim was not a virgin, if you're a rape victim and you're not a virgin, defense attorneys could present a woman's past sexual history to discredit her, and husbands could not be charged with rape at all. Most states prohibited single women from buying contraception. In 1968, the President's Crime Commission report stated that there were at least 1 million illegal abortions a year, and at least 1,000 women died annually from these practices. All right. For women of color, minority women were often the least educated and the poorest in our nation. So not only were they facing a racial uphill climb, but also a gender uphill climb. For every dollar earned by a white man, an African-American female would earn about 45 cents. Women of color, again, were doubly victimized by the twin immoralities. This is from Polly Murray, a female activist. This is Polly Murray too, by the way. There's a cool documentary on her on Amazon. If y'all have Amazon Prime, you can watch it for free. Women of color are what she called doubly victimized by the twin immoralities of Jim Crow and Jane Crow. So that's the famous quote from Polly Murray. We still have a little bit of time. Being gay in America, fun fact, it's illegal in every state. This includes sexual acts and also includes wearing clothing of the opposite gender. So if you you could actually not be gay and be female and wear men's pants, and you could get in trouble for that. And fun fact, back this time, men's pants buttoned in the front, zipped and buttoned in the front, women's pants zipped and buttoned on the side, which is how they would know that if you're wearing the wrong gender pants during this time. They even was that meticulous about it. If you were discovered to being gay, you could be fired from your job, and you would probably lose your family. This is a gay couple. This is Harvey Milk here from San Francisco. There's also no substantive number for how many gays and lesbians live in the United States, especially from this time, because nobody is telling anybody anything, right? You are not going to advertise that you were gay. So it's very dangerous for gay folks living in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. The thing that starts the thing that starts the gay civil rights movement in this country is known as the Stonewall riots. This happens in a small bar near Christopher Street in New York City, in the Greenwich Village area. Police are going to raid the inn. It's actually it's called the Stonewall Inn, but it's like this little club. There it is right there. It's real tiny. Police will come in and raid it. And so what they would do is they would come in and they would immediately separate people. So they'd be like, oh, these two dudes are dancing. That's illegal. And they'd line you up along the wall. And then you'd have to present an ID. And then they would have a police van where they put like everybody in them and take them away to be, and like, if you get arrested for being gay, well, that's bad news bears, right? So oftentimes a lot of people will like pay a fine or whatever. And so it's almost like bribery so that it doesn't go on your record. Because again, if it goes on your record and you're found to be gay, you will definitely lose your job. Speaking of which, during the mid 70s in Mesquite, so I see your Mesquite hoodie. So in Mesquite, Texas, a school counselor in Mesquite was arrested for what they call cruising. So he's like in a public park or a public bathroom area, like looking for a hookup. And you would have police officers who would pose as gay men and then like arrest them. He was arrested and somehow his name got leaked to the newspapers. And so his name was leaked on a Wednesday, and on Thursday he committed suicide in Dallas, Texas in the 1970s. Like that's how like dramatic it is. You do not want people to know that you're gay. So as the police come in to raid this little club, a group of what today we probably refer to as trans women, at the time they were drag queens, they were like, oh, hell no. And they start throwing bricks at the police. And it's all, not only trans women of color. So they're like throwing bricks at the police and like, nope, we're not doing this no more. And you get this entire raid. And so so here's an example. So they would line you up. And this guy was probably most likely wearing a dress at some point, and he took it off because he didn't want to be also arrested for wearing the wrong clothing. But the Stonewall riots will take place over a couple of days. And this starts what we know now as the Gay Liberation Front. The Gay Liberation Front, which is an organization in New York City, is the first LGBT organization to use the word gay in its title. So the first gay organization in Dallas was formed in 1965, which you guys probably be surprised by that. And that organization was known as the Circle of Friends. And they specifically, and also probably surprising to you guys, they specifically met on church grounds. So there were some ministers who were actually gay friendly in the 1960s in Dallas. And they would let them hold meetings on church grounds specifically because they knew police would not raid church property because of the high level of religiosity in the area of Dallas, that people would be appalled that police would go into a church and try to arrest people, which is why they held their meetings on church property. The Gay Liberation Front, though, will employ methods of protest used by anti-war and civil rights protesters. Ultimately, the GLB, or the Gay Liberation Front, the GLF, will only last for a few months because they start arguing with each other. And we get what's known as the Gay Activist Alliance. The Gay Activist Alliance started a newspaper called Gay, and the tagline was "Come Out and Gay Power." And many of those who were a part of the GLF will join the Gay Activist Alliance. And they employed what they called ZAP to get issues pertaining to gays and lesbians and knowledge. So they try to like hide things, like put the magazine between pieces of paper, because even the federal government would get you, you could get fined for mailing gay literature during this time period. This is where we're going to end with gay people in New York, but this is Diego Vinales. My Spanish is terrible. There was a raid at another gay club called Snake Pit, and Vinales was taken to the New York City police station, like the nearest unit that was near him, and he heard that they were going to charge him with being gay. Like he was going to get a file charged on him, so he would have a file. And rather than doing that, not realizing what was below him, he jumped out of a second-story window trying to escape, and he didn't realize that there was metal spikes there, and he impaled himself on a 14-inch spike fence because he was terrified of being labeled as gay. You see the first gay pride march will happen in June of 1970. And so this is an example of that. And these are just gay pride marches that you see. As a result of that, though, for those of you who don't know, the federal government today has issued that June is LGBT Awareness Month or Gay Pride Month. So often every June, especially if you guys are on social media, you'll see like Nike will put out like a Nike check with like a rainbow on it, and like beer companies will be like, oh, beer, right? But that's why everything happens in June. It's because the Stonewall riot started in June. So that's why a lot of cities will have their gay pride celebrations in June for that reason. All right. We're going to pick up with environmentalism on Thursday, and then we'll wrap up the semester with Reagan. Do we have any questions, comments, or concerns? All right, great. I will see you guys next Thursday, this Thursday.
Are you gonna go ahead and put that slide on?
Absolutely.